Hello and welcome to Monday in Parliament. Our look at the day at Westminster. The headlines: Labour asks whether additions to the council tax bill will provide a fair, reasonable solution to the pressures on social care, asking
why health ministers do not stand up for vulnerable and older people in this country and why they don't fight harder to get extra vital funding for social care.
The Defence Secretary spells out the difficulty of getting aid to the starving Syrian city of Aleppo.
It's almost impossible to get food or medicines in by airdrop when the air defences are controlled by Russia and the Syrian regime, and permissions are not forthcoming.
And peers share their Southern Rail misery.
Why can't we get the Board of Southern to go and stand on the cold, wet platforms at 6:15 in the morning and manage to get into London at least an hour late?
But first, Labour has warned the government it needs to do more to tackle the problems facing social care than raising extra money via council tax bills. It's been reported the government is considering raising the amount of council tax aimed specifically at social care from 2% to 5%. However, the government has countered that at the last election, Labour didn't offer any more money to local government to pay for social care.
Spending on long-term care in our country is more than the OECD average. In particular, it is more than comparable economies such as France and Germany. Nevertheless, I accept, Mr. Speaker, that our system is under strain, and that pressure has been building for some years now. Mr. Speaker, any system would benefit from higher budget, and social care is no exception. But quality matters too. Today is not a budget statement, nor a local government settlement. But I wish to end, Mr. Speaker, by commending again the many hundreds of thousands of carers who work so hard to make the current system work for so many.
Labour's Barbara Keeley reminded the minister that they had called for action on social care ahead of the recent autumn statement from the Chancellor of the Exchequer.
On this side, we called on the government to urgently bring forward promised funding to address that crisis. The Chancellor did not listen. He did not bring forward any funding for social care, nor indeed, Mr. Speaker, mention it at all. Can the Care Minister tell us in his response why health ministers do not stand up for vulnerable and older people in this country and why they don't fight harder to get extra vital funding for social care?
I hope in looking at coordinated policy across government, the Minister will look not only at good join-up between the Department of Health and local government, but also other policies like lifetime homes, family strengthening and flexible employment policies, all of which will help us deal with these issues. Could he give us some encouragement on that score?
Thank you. I thank you for that question. He is quite right. There's a whole raft of measures that need to be taken on informal carers, and also in terms of the holy grail of better integration of health and social care fundings, and we are pursuing that vigorously.
Basically, the back pressure from social care is actually what is causing the NHS to struggle. I totally agree with the Minister with regards to integration, and in Scotland, where we have the integrated joint boards, it has brought a change quicker than we would have hoped. Our delayed discharges are down 9% in a year. In England, they're up over 30%. But this isn't something that's easy, and it's something that needs to be funded.
I think the Minister has completely missed the point raised by my honourable friend from the front bench about the unfairness of asking councils to deal with the problem. A 1% rise in council tax in Doncaster raises 21% less than a council in the Prime Minister's constituency. Surely that means that the problem is being pushed onto the areas that can least afford it.
Mr. Speaker, she will be right. I would have missed the point had I not said that that issue that she has raised is addressed by the way that we distribute the additional Better Care Fund, which uses a formula which takes into account relative need.
Does the Minister share the view of the Care Quality Commission that the system is close to tipping point? And does he understand the impact that that has on very many frail elderly people? Does he not agree that now is the time to bury our differences, work together to come up with a long-term settlement for the health and care system?
Mr. Speaker, today is not the day in which we are going to announce a Royal Commission on the funding of care into the future. But I do agree, Mr. Speaker, that it's important that we do put care funding onto a better structural basis into the future, and the honourable member is right to say that.
the Health Minister, David Mowat. Later on in the day, there were reports that the Syrian government was claiming victory in the standoff with rebel forces in the city of Aleppo. At question time, the Defence Secretary, Sir Michael Fallon, told MPs it was almost impossible to get food aid into the war-torn city. Sir Michael said that Russian control of Syrian air defences meant that airdropping of aid would mean the planes would be shot down. Tens of thousands of people have been trapped with virtually no food or water.
Given the US and NATO's precision airdrop capability, can I ask the Secretary of State what conversations he's had with the incoming US administration and with other allies on the feasibility of using this specific capability to alleviate the suffering in Aleppo?
Well, we have continually examined options for getting aid into Aleppo, which is now where people are in the most appalling situation. It's almost impossible to get food or medicines in by airdrop when the air defences are controlled by Russia and the Syrian regime, and permissions are not forthcoming. We have looked at other options, such as using the airfield, but it is outside the control of the moderate opposition, militarised convoys, and we will continue to look at all kinds of options, but it is already very, very late for the people of eastern Aleppo.
Russia, for all its belligerence, does not want to trigger a conflict with the UK and our NATO allies. And the longer that this essentially cowardice goes on in the face of their posturing, the more that they will push and the harder it will be for any resolve to come to the dreadful tragedy that's happening in that country.
And we continue to look at any possibility of getting either food or medicine into Aleppo or indeed into some of the other besieged areas. But it isn't simply a question of Russian permission. We also would have to make sure that any drops are feasible, considering the vulnerability of aircraft to ground to air defence systems as well.
Doughty. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State said it was very late for the people of eastern Aleppo, but it isn't too late. And I would second the calls. Those RAF planes could be flying over, could be providing humanitarian airdrops. There are 200 members on both sides of this House, front and back benches on this side, who have signed a letter calling for this. Leading humanitarian organisations. Will he look at it again?
Well, we have continued to look, almost daily at the various ways in which we might be able to get food aid in. It is not possible in a contested airspace with ground-to-air missile systems and Russian aircraft flying overhead denying permission. It is not possible to fly coalition aircraft over Aleppo. And without that security, we are unable to drop food where it is most needed. But we continue to look at all the options.
Can I ask the Secretary of State if he will continue and will not at any stage give up on looking at any way that we can alleviate the terrible suffering that is going on in East Aleppo?
Well, I can give her that assurance. So we continue to look at these options, to talk to the NGOs who are willing to help us provide food and medicine, and some food and medicine is going into other cities in Syria, but not into Aleppo itself, simply because of the impossibility of flying aircraft in that airspace over Aleppo, and the very real risk of aircraft then being shot down.
The Defence Secretary, Sir Michael Fallon. Later, the Commons decided to have an emergency debate on how best to help Syrians trapped in Aleppo. The application was made by the Conservative former International Development Secretary, Andrew Mitchell.
The need for immediate concerted international action to evacuate from East Aleppo the remaining approximately 40 doctors, approximately 70 nursing staff, up to 500 children, at least 100 of whom have been wounded and are receiving rudimentary care, along with thousands of terrified civilians caught between the different fighting groups in a 10 by 10 kilometre enclave where most of those trapped now are. Mr. Speaker, I make no apology to the House for raising this vital issue again. You granted a debate on these matters 2 months ago. On that occasion, the Foreign Secretary made his first major speech from the dispatch box and expressed the horror so many feel at what is happening in Syria and Aleppo. I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, if you grant this emergency debate, the whole House will hope to hear an update from the Foreign Secretary, who has already shown his deep and principled concern about what is taking place.
The debate will be held on Tuesday, with the House updated on ongoing developments. Now, with 3 days of strike action on southern rail services in the south-east of England looming, members of the House of Lords urged the government to step in to end the long-running row over driver-only trains. Southern bosses have warned commuters not to use its services on Tuesday, even if the dispute is settled, because the service will be impacted regardless.
My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, and my honourable friend, the Rail Minister, are meeting frequently with GTR in order to be updated on the latest position and how the operator will provide services on days of industrial action. It is also important to note that this is a dispute between the operator and the unions. My right honourable friend, the Secretary of State, has also written to union leaders in an attempt to bring this dispute to an end.
Rather than taking sides, shouldn't the government be trying to put pressure on both sides in this dispute, given the 6 months of intolerable disruption for consumers in the southern region, and force the parties through the media to come to terms through ACAS in the next few days ahead of Christmas?
Well, I agree with the noble lord, and that's exactly what my right honourable friend did. He wrote to both unions and asked them to meet with Southern at ACAS, and that was supposed to take place yesterday. That meeting didn't take place because the unions hadn't responded to the invitation from my right honourable friend, the Secretary of State. And this isn't about taking sides. I agree with the noble lord. This is about getting this long-standing dispute resolved.
This is just no good. Today, the first two trains this morning were delayed. No excuse. Sorry, there were no guards or no drivers or something. And then the people get into the carriages and take the tabloids that are available today, and most of the tabloids have full-page ads from Southern saying, oh, we're sorry. But nothing about it. Why can't we get the Board of Southern to go and stand on the cold, wet platforms at 6:15 in the morning and manage to get into London at least an hour late?
I know my noble friend has raised this issue both in your lordship's house and also with me bilaterally, and let me assure her I do not miss an opportunity to ensure the Secretary of State is fully aware of the strong sentiments in your lordship's house.
On strike days, there is continuous disruption on this line, and those of us who travel on it daily have to suffer the farce that has been going on for longer than 6 months. Can the noble Lord the Minister tell the House what discussions the government has had with the company regarding the management of their sickness and absence policy? Because it is precious little comfort to those of us who are trying to get on a train or waiting for trains to be told time and time again that there's a temporary shortage of train crew. What is the company doing about that? It's all very well to go on about how the union is not doing what you want it to do, but I have to say the company has come out of this argument over the last 9 to 12 months looking shabby indeed.
Yeah. As the noble lady knows, I've acknowledged the fact that their communications have been ineffective and the company itself has to take responsibility. I've never stood at the dispatch box and said that this is an issue or a problem or raised just by the unions alone. It's a challenge. There are challenges between the actual company and Network Rail, and in that regard my right honourable friend, Secretary of State, as the noble lady will know, has appointed Chris Gibb to look specifically to the issues of the continual issues, not on strike days, which arise, as she's rightly highlighted, on ensuring that the issues on the line can be resolved.
The Transport Minister, Lord Ahmed. You're watching Monday in Parliament. Our top story. Labour has warned the government that using a portion of council tax to boost funding for social care will create a two-tier service. But a health minister says cash would be allocated on the basis of need. Labour has made a call for 21st Century Fox's interest in the broadcaster Sky to be referred to the media watchdog Ofcom. Fox's owner, Rupert Murdoch, already has a 39% stake in Sky. A previous attempt to take full control of Sky failed 5 years ago, as the Shadow Culture Minister reminded the Commons.
Will the Minister commit the government here and now to issuing a public interest intervention notice and referring the bid to Ofcom? Remember, back in 2012, Ofcom's assessment of the CEO of Fox, James Murdoch, was that he, and I quote, repeatedly fell short of the exercise of responsibility to be expected of him as CEO and chairman. The Prime Minister met Rupert Murdoch in New York in September. Was the bid discussed then?
The Secretary of State has powers to intervene in certain media mergers on public interest grounds set out in the Enterprise Act 2002. Government guidance on the operation of the public interest merger provisions under that Act give an indication of how the intervention regime will operate in practice, and the approach the Secretary of State is likely to adopt in considering cases. Any transaction will be looked at on its merits, on a case-by-case basis. The guidance makes clear that the Secretary of State will aim to take an initial decision on whether to intervene within 10 working days of formal notification of the merger to the competition authorities or of the transaction being brought to her attention. No such formal notification has yet been received.
The Culture Minister with responsibility for digital services, Matt Hancock. Now, how long should it take before Britain leaves the European Union? Theresa May has said she intends to trigger Article 50 in March, leading to a 2-year exit procedure. But what happens after that? The Chancellor, Philip Hammond, has indicated that he favours a more drawn-out transition period rather than a clean break.
I'd just like to move on to the question of transitional arrangements for leaving the EU. Do you think they're going to be necessary?
There is, I think, an emerging view among businesses, among regulators, and among thoughtful politicians, as well as, I think, probably quite a universal view among civil servants on both sides of the English Channel, that having a longer period to manage the adjustment between where we are now as full members of the European Union and where we get to in the future as a result of the negotiations that we will be conducting would be generally helpful, would tend towards a smoother transition, and would run less risks of disruption, including, crucially, risks to financial stability, which must be a very real concern.
Can I take it that the answer is yes?
That's another way of putting it, yes.
Yes, okay.
I don't think we should approach this on the basis that we need transitional arrangements, because I think we can only get to a situation where we have a transition if there is a genuine meeting of minds on both sides of this negotiation that they are beneficial.
We, the current members of the EU,
yes, collectively.
Need transitional arrangements.
Collectively, I think transitional arrangements would be beneficial to us.
Right. What they're talking about, in a nutshell, is a risk of severe instability. Are these representations being made to you?
Yes, we are hearing particularly from the financial services sector, of concerns in this area, which, as you say, fall into two categories, I think. They are about disruption to patterns of business. Remember that the financial services sector in London supports, in many ways, the real economy across the European Union, businesses in the manufacturing and agricultural sectors, for example. But also that if changes in practice are carried out in haste, there is a danger that regulatory procedures will not be as robust as they should be, that a full understanding of what is being regulated will not necessarily be had by all regulators involved. And this would run risks for stability of the financial system as a whole.
The committee member Rachel Reeves was a friend of the murdered MP Jo Cox. She had this question for the Chancellor about the single being released in Mrs Cox's memory.
You'll be aware that our colleague Kevin Brennan and other parliamentarians are releasing a single before Christmas to raise money for the Jo Cox Foundation. I was wondering whether the Treasury would consider waiving VAT on that single so that more money could be raised for the causes that Jo cared so much about.
Of course, the government fully supports the efforts of parliamentary colleagues and others to raise funds for the Jo Cox Foundation, and we've heard those representations. You will be aware, members of the committee will be aware, that the government doesn't have it in its power to waive VAT because of European Union rules. But what I can do, and I will do, is announce that the government will donate to the foundation an equivalent amount to the VAT paid on the sales of the forthcoming single You Can't Always Get What You Want.
Thank you very much, Chancellor. I very much welcome that decision, and thank you to you and to your colleagues in government.
The Labour MP Rachel Reeves. Thousands of people have been killed in the conflict in Yemen, in which Saudi Arabia is leading a campaign to restore the country's government. Last week, the Foreign Secretary, Boris Johnson, earned a rebuke from Downing Street for accusing the Saudis of puppeteering and playing proxy wars. MPs complained that UK policy was no longer clear on the issue.
Please confirm that we will never be involved in any puppeteering or proxy wars anywhere in the world, including in Yemen. Our influence and credibility as an honest broker is now being seriously questioned. When we criticise Russia's bombing of Aleppo, the Russians are accusing us of supporting the same thing in Yemen. Further to what the Minister has said, can he clarify that our objective is an immediate ceasefire, and can he lay out the detail on how we will get to that position? As the Foreign Secretary has said, we hold the pens on Yemen at the United Nations. There is already a draft Security Council resolution calling for an immediate ceasefire, resumption of peace talks and humanitarian access. Where is this resolution now? Will it be tabled before the Security Council before the end of the year? We must not fiddle as Yemen burns.
Humanitarian access is vital. I made it very, very clear that we are investing more funds to make sure that we can support the UN agencies and others in order to get through. The United Nations Security Council resolution that he touches on is still being discussed in New York as we speak. And as I mentioned, the Quad meeting, which will actually take these matters further, is coming up in the very, very near future. He does touch on a comparison perhaps between Yemen and the conflict, and indeed in Syria. I make it very clear that President Hadi, the support for him, the coalition that has been created, has the backing of the United Nations through the resolution 2216. There is a legitimate call for supporting President Hadi and the work that he's done.
The Foreign Secretary on this was absolutely right. We say on this, good for you, Boris. And yet he's still been slapped down by Downing Street. He has been forced to go to Riyadh to clarify his remarks, and he has sent his junior minister here today to support Saudi Arabia's actions to the hilt. It seems that he will not support our calls for an independent UN investigation into Saudi Arabia's alleged war crimes, and he will continue selling them arms to prosecute its proxy wars. There is no consistency, there is no principle, there is just more shabby hypocrisy.
We hear so much about the government's positive relationship with Saudi Arabia, although it's not clear whether that extends to the Foreign Secretary. But what good is that relationship if the government cannot or will not use its influence to prevent the killing and starvation of innocent civilians?
Speaking to the Yemeni diaspora in Liverpool, their very clear message is they fear for the lives of people back home. This is a country on the edge of famine. Can I urge the government, and in particular, it's good to see the DFID Minister here, to do everything that we can as a country to relieve the humanitarian crisis in Yemen?
What representations has Her Majesty's government made to the Iranian government to stop the flow of arms to the Houthis? And at the same time, what representations have been made to facilitate with the Iranians the opening of the port so that much needed and desperate aid can get through to the Yemenis that are suffering in this civil war?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman raises a very, very important point. What is Iran's involvement in Yemen? Is it helpful or is it hindering events? Prime Minister made this very, very clear, that Iran can play a more constructive role in making sure weapon systems are not entering the country itself, in making sure that the Houthis are encouraged to come to the table, in making sure that the Red Sea remains absence of ships that might come in to want to arm the Houthis, and to make sure that port comes over. These are the messages that we're asking Iran to recognise.
Until the last question I've just heard, there's been no mention of Iran. So I say to the Minister that the United Kingdom must take some responsibility for the continuing and escalating violence in Yemen, because if we have not agreed to the nuclear deal, the billions of pounds of resources would not be able to go into this conflict, and indeed in conflicts in Syria and in Lebanon and other parts of the Middle East.
The new MP for Sleaford and North Hykeham, Dr Caroline Johnson, has been sworn in at the House of Commons.
Will the member wishing to take her seat please come to the table?
The Conservative won the seat in a by-election following the resignation of a fellow Tory, Stephen Phillips, who disapproved of the government's strategy on Brexit.
I swear by Almighty God that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth, her heirs and successors, according to law. So help me God.
And that's all from me for now. Christina Cooper is here for the rest of the week, but from me, Joanna Shin, goodbye.